What does science say happens when you put strychnine in grandma's tea? What's going to happen to grandma?
Die?
She dies.
Yeah.
Does science answer the question, is it right to put strychnine in grandma's tea in order to get the inheritance of millions of dollars?
No.
Exactly. So science is a study of process. The Bible never answers the question, what process did God use to create? So I do not know what process God used to create. So therefore, I turn to science to answer that question. But science never answers the question, who created? Or why he, she, or they created? The question of purpose. So science is a wonderful branch of knowledge. But if anybody on this university campus thinks it's the only branch of knowledge, that's sad. Really sad. And a lot of people do. It's epitomized by the statement, unless I can see it, I can't believe in it. Really? You're contradicting yourself. Can you see the principle, unless I can see it, I can't believe in it? No, that's a principle. That's a philosophical principle. You can't see it. So you see this whole idea that unless it's scientifically provable, it's not true, is really sad. It's incredibly prejudiced, very narrow-minded thinking. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. So I haven't read the Bible in all of its entirety yet. I've read a couple of books. Are there any real contradictions in the Bible? Because I hear that there are, but I know it's the fulfilling of a prophecy, and I know it's a bunch of different accounts of different things. So I'd just like some clarity in that regard.
Great question. This gentleman asked, are there contradictions in the Bible? All right, the answer that I'm going to give, a lot of professors would disagree with. So I'm going to try and pull it out a little bit.
Go ahead.
No. I would insist there are no contradictions in the Bible. Is there paradox? Yes, there is. Is there mystery? Yes, there is. Are there manuscript variants in the earliest Greek manuscripts that we have of the New Testament? Yes, there are. And that's why Bart Ehrman, head of the religion department up at UNC Chapel Hill, loves to point that out, that there are between 200 and 400,000 manuscript variants that we have today. And then Dr. Ehrman goes on to point out, that's why you're an idiot if you trust the New Testament. Let me tell you the mistake he makes. He's not telling you in how many manuscripts are all those variants found. They're found in 25,000 Greek manuscripts, or Latin Vulgate manuscripts, or Ethiopic, Coptic, Armenian, Slavic, Gothic manuscripts. We have over 5,800 Greek manuscripts. We have 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts, and we have about 9,300 in the Slavic, Armenian, Gothic, Ethiopic, Coptic manuscripts. So we've got about 25,000 manuscripts.
Yeah.
And within those 25,000, there are between 200 and 400,000 manuscript variants. Okay, so that's a challenge. That's a problem with the New Testament. Well, what do? You don't just throw up your hands and say, it's unreliable. That's being ignorant.
Yeah.
Instead, you say, okay, what are the variants? How big a problem are they? 99% of those variants have to do with, is a word singular or plural? Is the article definite or indefinite? They change nothing. I'll give you another example. One of the manuscripts is in Matthew, chapter 1. In certain Greek manuscripts, we read one time, Jesus was the son of Mary who was a virgin. In another Greek manuscript, 2 times, Jesus was the son of Mary who was a virgin. So I think the evidence is, it was only stated once. An overly enthusiastic scribe put it in a second time. Changes nothing in terms of the message, but it is several manuscript variants, obviously.
Yeah.
So, are there contradictions? No, there are not contradictions. Another big example would be slavery. In the Old Testament, there is slavery, but never once does God call for slavery. Instead, the laws that you have in the Old Testament are how to restrict slavery. In the New Testament, Paul writes, slaves, obey your masters. Yes, he does. Does that mean he approves of slavery? No. You've got to study slavery in the Roman Empire. Over 50% of the people were slaves in the empire. Doctors and lawyers were slaves. In other words, slavery in the Roman Empire was not like chattel slavery in the antebellum South. In fact, in Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, we read, if you kidnap a person and are either caught with them or you sell them, you are to be put to death. That's a pretty clear statement about the horrors of slavery, of kidnapping and then selling or keeping that person as your slave. Exodus 21, verse 16. So, some people would say, but when Paul says, slaves obey your masters, he's obviously contradicting. If you kidnap someone and are caught with them, you're going to be killed. No, it's not. What Paul is doing is, he's not calling for an armed revolt on the part of all the slaves in the Roman Empire. Instead, he's saying, slaves, obey your masters, but if you can get your freedom, do so. And he writes the letter of Philemon, where he asks a slaveholder, Philemon, to accept a runaway slave, Onesimus, back, no longer as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. Are those hard issues? Yes, they are. Are they easy to think through? No, they are not. But I would insist there are no contradictions in the Bible. Is there paradox? Yes. Is there mystery? Yes. Are there unanswered questions? Yes, there are. Contradiction? No. A contradiction is A and not A, non-A are saying the same thing. That's a contradiction. That's wrong. No, A and non-A are not both equally true at the same time in the same way. That's a contradiction. You do not have contradiction anywhere in the Bible.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, sir, for raising that. Stuart, do you have a thought on that?
Well, so a common one would be the eyewitnesses to the tomb after the resurrection, right?
Yeah.
And so some eyewitnesses got there, Mary Magdalene, for example, and said, hey, there's just one angel. Then the next group of eyewitnesses came and said, no, there were two. But if I spoke with you, and I didn't get to talk to you, but you both were there, and I said, oh, there was one angel. But then the next group comes in and says, no, there were two. Well, just because I'm talking to you and I didn't mention you, there's no contradiction there, right? Just because I didn't mention both angels. No, it was just the one that I spoke to at the time. So, if there was collusion in the Bible, that would become apparent very quickly to most of us, right? If all the Gospels, for example, John had a longer time, the Gospel of John, the writer of John had a longer time because it was written in 90 AD to reflect on the events themselves of Jesus' lifetime. And so what did he do? He wrote some theological musings on things like the Trinity, things like who is this Jesus Christ? While Mark, early on, just gives the eyewitness details, really. It's written in a very short, compressed kind of way. And I like that. I love that. If you have the exact words in terms of eyewitness testimony, in terms of who Jesus was from John, as you do Mark, you think, oh, they just kind of colluded and they came up with some fabricated story that they wanted to really push about this Jesus Christ, kind of in a power play sort of way. So, no collusion going on, difference in details, but in no way are there any contradictions. Yeah. And what I love is the top New Testament scholars, many secular as well as Christian, have studied these passages for hundreds of years and have worked through them to say, even the secular types, this has really been done away with in a way where even they will admit, no, these are not direct contradictions.
So you'd say there's no evidence of like tampering or, I guess like you said, collusion of changing or like editing with the Bible with some of the people that wrote like many years after the event, or the New Testament, like many years after the events that they describe happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah.
No, sir. There are many false New Testaments. They're called the Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, like the Gospel of Mary, like the Gospel of Pontius Pilate. Those were not written by eyewitnesses or by those who knew the eyewitnesses. Those were written in the 2nd century by people who had a natural philosophical assumption, which was Gnosticism. Gnosticism taught the physical is evil, the spiritual is good. Therefore, the God of Genesis 1 is evil because he creates material reality. And that Gnostic philosophy you will find in almost all of the Gnostic Gospels, including the Gospel of Thomas. All right? So you've got these false Gospels, Gnosticism, Gnostic Gospels. The Gospel of Peter. Jesus resurrects. But what does he do? He comes out of the tomb with his arms on 2 angels. And the cross comes out following him, and the cross is a talking cross. And the cross, the wooden crossbeam, talks to people. That is so different from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's scary.
Yeah.
All right? So if anybody thinks, oh, well, this was a credible eyewitness source, they're blowing smoke in your face.
Yeah. You know, I'm reading the Bible right now. I have like I think it's New American Bible. Would those wouldn't be in the New American Bible?
No, they would not. No, the Gnostic Gospels are separate, but there's, Dan Brown wrote the Da Vinci Code a number of years ago, and there was a great hullabaloo over that. And inevitably, Time or some other magazine is going to come out with In Search of the Historical Jesus. And the point of the Jesus Seminar people, many of whom are good scholars, is the New Testament is filled with errors, filled with contradictions, and it's impossible to really get to know the real historical Jesus.
Yeah.
And I would call that hyperskepticism, because they're demanding a degree of certainty that they are unwilling to apply to any other book.
I got it.
Skepticism, I applaud. Jesus applauded skepticism. You don't blindly believe anything, otherwise you'll get your lunch eaten. But hyperskepticism is incredible. One quick example. Next week, a doctor says to me, Cliff, you have cancer. I say, whoa, I'm going to go get a second opinion. I go get a second opinion. The doctor says, it's cancer, Cliff. I say, whoa, I'm going to go get a third opinion. Third doctor, Cliff, you've got cancer. All right, I don't think there's anything wrong with getting a second or third opinion.
Yeah.
But if I'm getting the 50th or 100th opinion, I think I'm dealing with hyperskepticism.
Yeah.
I've got an agenda, and my agenda is, don't tell me I've got cancer. And if you do tell me I have cancer and you're a doctor, I'm going to go find another doctor, and I might even pay him to tell me I don't have cancer. And that's dishonest.
Yeah.
Okay? So yes, we got to be skeptical when it comes to the reliability of the New Testament documents.
Yeah.
But there's a hyperskepticism that demands a precise agreement in every detail that I think is embarrassing. To be honest with you, it's embarrassing intellectually. Because you can't treat any book that way. You can't treat American history, African history, South American history, Chinese history that way.
Yeah.
There's going to be some discrepancy. It doesn't mean we can't know anything historically.
It's called hermeneutics of suspicion. So if you hear your professors just attacking the Bible way more so than any other ancient historical document, just look at them and say, I believe you are taking part in the hermeneutics of suspicion. It's okay. I'm not against. I'm not out here saying, oh, just look at a supernatural event like the resurrection and don't look at it with any type of suspicion. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But the hermeneutics of suspicion, it already really writes it off.
Yeah.
It's beyond just suspicion.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with so many professors here. They will, if they're totally honest with you, they will say, I realize I'm way too skeptical and I'm holding this standard that's way higher than any other standard that is applied to looking at ancient historical documentation and the credibility behind it. But if I don't do this, I will lose my book sales. I will probably be fired from South Carolina University.
Yeah.
Look into that, because I promise that is not something we just out here blindly say.
Yeah.
It's something that he's talked to with professors about, and it's written endlessly about. Yeah.
But why were there so many people back in the Old Testament, especially, who believed in God that had multiple wives or concubines?
Excellent question. It's an embarrassing fact that King David, a man after God's own heart, had several wives and a bunch of concubines. Why did that happen? Because David was a dirty, rotten sinner. Same way I am. My sin gets expressed differently. I don't have a bunch of wives and I don't have any concubines. But that doesn't make me better than David, because I have lusted, I've been proud, I've been mean, I've been self-centered. So I'm not this wonderful person that I wish you all would believe that I am. I'm a rebel against God. And you're absolutely right. The polygamy, the sex with concubines, that David and then his son Solomon just went off the charts with 700 wives and 300 concubines. I mean, it was just incredible. And what happened? David's family suffered because of his sexual immorality. What he did with Bathsheba led to some family breakdown that was sick, sad, and tragic. And then what Solomon did to the nation of Israel when he had his 700 wives and 300 concubines was so sick because it led directly into idolatry, into turning his back on God and buying into pluralism, the belief in many gods, polytheism. So, never is that said to be good. Now, just one more point quickly. Matthew 19. Jesus is asked, well, if divorce is wrong, then why did Moses permit men to write a certificate of divorce and divorce their wives? Now, Jesus says something there that really gives you a tip into answering that gentleman's question who just walked away to class when he asked, what about the Old Testament? What about the New Testament? Okay, see what Jesus is saying. Moses allowed men to write a certificate of divorce and divorce their wives. But then he goes on and says, but it was not that way from the beginning. And then he quotes Genesis 2:24. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So you see, when he says Moses permitted this due to the hardness of your hearts, he's pointing out that yes, God has been incredibly patient with us rebels. And in the Old Testament, divorce, although that was never God's desire, was permitted in the case of adultery and things like that. Stuart?
Well, 3 P's that kind of you're getting at. Patriarchalism, polygamy, and the law of primogeniture. So, men have incredible rule over females in a horrible sense. That's patriarchalism. Primogeniture is you favor the eldest, and so it's strong favoritism. It's like I just love my oldest child the most. And that's just how things work. God never commanded it to be so. That was just the culture of the day. Now, we see that even now. Some parents will literally say, oh yeah, I like that child more than that child. And watch how that family dynamic occurs over the years. And not so healthy, let's just say, to favor one child. So, primogeniture, patriarchalism, and then polygamy that you covered. My only addition to that is look at one of the top Hebrew scholars, if not the top in our country now, Robert Alter, not a Christian, but he said, look at how the stories of Jacob and Esau, where Jacob was favored because he was the elder, primogeniture, or look at the story of Jacob with his wives, Leah and Rachel, so that's polygamy. Look at how those stories ended up working out. Not too well. And I would say Moses and the biblical authors are trying to make a point. This is what Robert Alter is saying, not me. He's the Hebrew scholar. Clearly, the authors are trying to say, don't do this. Don't live in a patriarchal kind of way, a polygamous kind of way, or through the law of primogeniture, because things are not going to work out well for you.
Do you think there's like a metaphorical sense, like one day for God could be billions of years for us, or some way to explain that discrepancy between the timeline?
Okay, great question. Stuart, what do you think?
No.
No, okay.
No way.
All right. How do you interpret any book here at the University of South Carolina? Hopefully, you respect literary style and you read in context. And if you depart from either one of those, you're going to be in trouble. Is this scientific literary style? Is this poetry? Is this a play by Shakespeare? Is this mathematics? Is this didactic moral teaching? You better learn to pick up on literary style. And then second point is, you better never rip out of context. You take one line out of Othello and say, that's Shakespeare's worldview. You're in trouble, big trouble. You will flunk fast. Okay, those 2 things. But please do that with the Bible. All right, so read Genesis chapter 1. What's the literary style? I would argue it's pretty close to poetry. Why? Because you will see parallelism. The Hebrew people did not write poetry where every word at the end of the line rhymed. Instead, there was parallelism. All right, let's go through it quickly. What does God create on day one? Okay. What does he create? And light, right? What does he create on day 4? The sun. What did he create on day 2? Separation of the land and the water. What does he create on day 5? Fish and birds. What does he create on day 3? Animals. What does he create on day 6? Human life. See the parallelism between just go back and read Genesis 1. Day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, day 3 and day 6. And there's parallelism there. So, although it's not strictly Hebrew poetry, it leans in that direction. Therefore, I'm convinced it is intellectually dishonest for me to say Genesis chapter 1 is telling us exactly when God created and exactly how he created. Just think about who wrote Genesis 1. Probably Moses. Who was the audience that Moses was writing to? A bunch of Jews. Where were they? They were on the edge of the promised land, shaken in their sandals because they knew that they were supposed to go in and take the promised land. Do you think that the Jews were sitting in their tents saying, gosh, what scientific process did God use to create? No. They could give a rip. But they were certainly concerned with who is the true living God who's all powerful, who created the universe. Yeah, that was highly relevant to them at that point. So that's the audience that Moses is writing to. Ah, Cliff, you're just going down a liberal path. Really? In the early 400s, a brilliant Christian thinker named Augustine pointed out that in light of the fact that the sun is not created till the 4th day, how were the first 3 days measured? And that was long before Charles Darwin, guys. And that's Augustine, a deeply committed follower of Christ from Africa who read the scriptures honestly and said, wait a second. The sun is not created till the 4th day. How were the first 3 days measured? Because guess what, guys? You don't have a day without the sun, right? And the earth going around the sun. Now, am I saying that I know that God did not create in 6 24-hour periods? No, I don't know. All I'm saying is the text does not specify. So be honest with the text. And if the text does not specify, you got to say, I don't know. But if we're going to get overly specific with the text, I don't think that's fair.
Do you think it's the same case with like Noah and the ark? Because they also try to use like geological evidence for like the flood not being kind of documented in that way. Do you think that's more of a metaphorical like poetry kind of thing? Or?
All right, everything before Genesis chapter 12 is different. I think in Genesis 12 with Abraham, it becomes real clear. Historical person, space-time, this is it. First 11 chapters are more difficult, especially chapters 1 and 2, when it comes to what is the literary style, what is being communicated here. And that is why if anybody ever says to you, science contradicts the Bible, you got to say, whoa, time out. What is science? Science is a study of process, how the organism works. There is no scientific literature anywhere in the Bible. No biology, no chemistry, no physics, no zoology, no astronomy. Oh, that's wrong, Cliff. In Joshua 10:13, it says that Joshua stopped the sun. Sure does. Guess what? I am convinced that is a symbolic, metaphorical statement. Oh, no, that's just wiggling out of it, Cliff. Really? Then please watch morning news tomorrow morning. And when the folks on ABC, NBC, and CBS say, sunrise is at 6:34, sunset is at 7 p.m., you better call ABC, NBC, and CBS up and tell them they've got a really antiquated view of the solar system. Don't you dummies realize that the sun doesn't rise and the sun doesn't set? It's the Earth that goes around the sun, fellas. So what on earth are you doing talking about sunrise and sunset? How unscientific. And they're going to hopefully respond to you. Listen, sir, you don't understand literary style and the different forms of speech. We're obviously speaking symbolically. We're obviously speaking metaphorically. So don't try and make us sound like we're contradicting science when we talk about sunrise and sunset. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
And it's not a wiggling out when it comes to Genesis 1 and 2, because he made a great point in terms of poetry in Genesis 1, and then it seems like you get more of a historical account in Genesis 2. All right, there's more of that, a lot more, in the book of Exodus and Judges. Deborah, this is a great argument against sexism in the Bible. Deborah is lifted up as this judge, even as a military figure in some ways, and she, after conquering a group of people, the Israelites do, I think it's the Midianites, Scripture says that the stars came down and fought for them, and you have more poetic language. But then the chapter before that, you had more of a historical account of the war. And so oftentimes you have that song after the historical account, or before, but then you get in Exodus as well, you have the Israelites writing a song after the crossing of the Red Sea. So the crossing of the Red Sea sounds more historical, and the song comes after in celebration of what God has done. Now you also have to be careful when it comes to literalism. I one time did a video where I said that Adam and Eve ate the apple. And I had tons of Christians get very upset with me in calling it an apple. They said, how dare you call the fruit an apple? Now, I wasn't thinking too much when I said apple instead of fruit. I think an apple is part of the fruit. I think it's in the class. And so Christians need to be very careful when it comes to how do you determine what is literal, like you said, what is figurative, what is metaphorical, what is apocalyptic, and then interpret. And look, I do believe that Satan in the garden was a serpent, something that actually slithered on the ground. But if someone comes to me and says, well, we're not certain that it was exactly a serpent, I'm not going to say, well, you don't take the Bible seriously. You're not a Christian. No, you can't come down that hard. Just like you got to be careful when it says that Jesus is a door, right? He's not two pieces of plywood. I mean, so the people we sometimes talk to, and there are many Christians out there that need to be careful when it comes to biblical literalism and saying, if you don't believe that the Bible's saying that the earth is this many years old, then you don't take the Bible seriously at all. I'd like to invite you to Grace Community Church, located at 365 Lukeswood Road in New Canaan, Connecticut. Our services are at 9:30 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. on Sundays. Hope you can join us.